on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss how to use U.S. sanctions to ramp up pressure on Russia's state-owned nuclear energy monopoly, Rosatom, and prevent Vladimir Putin from using it as a tool of malign influence. I ask unanimous consent to enter into a statement in the record from Ukrainian Energy Minister German Galushenko on the threat Rosatom poses to Ukraine and the world, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In his statement, the minister makes the plea for tougher sanctions to slash the Kremlin's profits from Rosatom's operations, reduce Russia's share of the global civil nuclear market, and to spur Western companies to step up and to replace Rosatom's nuclear goods and services. I also ask unanimous consent to enter a statement into the record from the Uranium Producers of America. Their statement commends the subcommittee for holding this hearing, highlights the malign activities of Rosatom and the Russian Federation, and supports our efforts to implement robust sanctions against Rosatom. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Unfortunately, last month, we marked the 2-year anniversary of Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. President Biden's sluggish policies have consistently prevented Ukraine's victory, given Putin room to breathe, and dragged out this conflict. He has slow-walked the critical weapon systems that Ukraine needs to win, like long-range attack missiles. His administration has only recently started pushing our European allies to transfer frozen Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine, which should have been done long, long ago. Finally, the sanctions against the Putin regime have not convinced him to end this gruesome war. For example, last year's Russian GDP growth of 3% exceeded all of the G7 economies and is forecasted to do so again in 2024. This hearing will examine how to strengthen U.S. sanctions by ratcheting up pressure on one of the most nefarious tools of Russian malign influence, Rosatom. Let us review some of Rosatom's worst behavior. Its personnel are engaged in the Russian military occupation of Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, is working to help Putin's war machine evade Western sanctions. It is supporting China's nuclear breakout. It has created dangerous dependencies around the globe that allow Putin to exert influence over the U.S. and our allies. Like Nord Stream 2 and concerns over the West's dependence on Russian LNG, Putin has created a similar scenario with Rosatom and dependence on Russian nuclear fuel. It has played a key role in helping to develop Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, despite this litany of threats to U.S. national security, the U.S. has sanctioned only a handful of Rosatom's subsidiaries and corporate officers, while Rosatom itself remains untouched. We must get serious, and that is why I'm holding today's hearing. I'm in the process of drafting a tough sanctions bill that will mandate the administration decouple the U.S. and our allies from Rosatom. And U.S. and allied companies from Westinghouse to Urenco are taking big steps to providing Western alternatives to Rosatom. Ukraine, for example, has freed itself from Rosatom's grip. Other allies, from Sweden to Finland to the Czech Republic, are doing the same. But tougher sanctions are needed to hasten this decoupling from Rosatom. Importantly, my sanctions bill will be complementary to my colleagues, Chair McMorris-Rodgers' House-passed bill, the Prohibiting Russian Uranium Imports Act. Her bill prohibits the U.S. from importing Russian low-enriched uranium with a waiver authority that terminates after 2027. My sanctions bill will similarly have a waiver authority to responsibly and to rapidly address dependencies such as those related to medical and industrial isotopes that will take slightly longer to unwind. But this authority will be narrow. These two bills together will send a much-needed market signal to the civil nuclear industry. The result will be a safer supply of nuclear fuel for the U.S. and its allies. That is why the Uranium Producers of America are aptly supporting our efforts to sanction Rosatom and Chair McMorris-Rodgers' bill. Every penny that Rosatom earns directly finances Putin's genocide in Ukraine and contributes to China's growing nuclear arsenal. The time to act is now. The chair will now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any statement that he may have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Keane, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for being here and for your testimony. Over 2 years ago, on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched its unprovoked full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine. Thankfully, due to a global coalition formed by U.S. leadership and, most importantly, a determined and resolute Ukrainian population, Russia failed in this effort. Despite its failure on the battlefield, Russia has continued to succeed in its goals of spreading malign influence and undermining democratic governance. Today, we focus specifically on Rosatom, Russia's state-owned corporation responsible for its civil nuclear program and military nuclear enterprises, and an agent of influence headed by the Russian government. For decades, Rosatom has spread its malign influence through contracts in Europe and around the world to build nuclear reactors and provide nuclear fuel at cheaper prices. More recently, Rosatom's complicity and support of Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine, its occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and its continued market share in the nuclear fuel establishment and fabrication sectors have enabled Putin to recklessly use Rosatom to spread Kremlin malign influence and to push its imperialistic goals. Recognizing the threat of Rosatom, the Biden administration and Congress have taken action, including by sanctioning Rosatom subsidiaries and cutting off key revenue streams. Putin uses these revenue streams directly for his war and his effort in aggression against Ukraine. For example, last year, President Biden worked with G7 partners in Sapporo, Japan, to mobilize $4.2 billion in government-led investments to develop a secure, reliable nuclear energy supply chain. Furthermore, in February 2024, the administration initiated a critical minerals dialogue with Central Asian partners through the C5+1 mechanism to increase Central Asia's involvement in global critical mineral supply chains and strengthen economic cooperation. These arguments follow up historic partnerships between U.S. companies and governments including Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. Yet, while the world acts to lessen Russia's global sphere of influence, Putin and the Kremlin continue their brutal war in Ukraine, targeting energy supply lines, critical infrastructure, and holding Zaporizhzhia's nuclear power plant and its workers hostage. As Ukrainian Prosecutor General Andrei Kostin told me, these attacks hit at the heart of Ukraine's environmental stability as well. They seek to undermine and poison the bountiful and prosperous land Ukraine sits on and starve the Ukrainian people of the resources they need to thrive. As part of the efforts to seek our solutions to combat Russia's malign influence in the nuclear energy sector, I've worked with a ranking member of the full committee, Meeks, on legislation to sanction the Rosatom officials who undermine Zaporizhzhia's stability and hold them accountable for the destabilizing actions they conduct. In addition to implementing further sanctions where appropriate, we must also go on the offense and promote continued investment in capacity building for alternative sources of nuclear energy and next-generation reactor designs, areas of the nuclear supply chain in which Russia has a significant presence today. These alternatives must be cost-effective with competitive prices that will ensure their long-term success. We must also follow up on Congress's investment of $700 million in the Inflation Reduction Act in the development of high-assay, low-enriched uranium, known as HALO. This HALO fuel is used in many small modular and advanced reactors. Historic investments in infrastructure will pay dividends abroad and support not only Ukrainians' war effort, but also combat Russia's malign influence. Finally, tomorrow marks 1 month since the Senate passed the National Security Supplemental Package by a wide bipartisan margin. As President said during his State of the Union address, history is watching. Yet our most recent former president, Donald John Trump, told Hungary's autocratic leader, Viktor Orban, this week that he would not support a nickel for Ukraine. Even more, the Hungarian government welcomed Rosatom's CEO to Budapest today on the 25th anniversary of Hungarian's membership in NATO to discuss shared priorities. The contrast between this president's support for democracies and our former president's support for autocracies could not be clearer. It unfortunately bears repeating. The quickest and most direct way to combat Rosatom and Russia is to pass this supplemental request immediately, which includes almost $3 billion to boost domestic nuclear fuel production and enrichment. If the House is truly serious about combating Russia's malign influence, we have no alternative. It is inexplicable that Speaker Johnson continues to hold up this spending package, which has the majority of support among members. We cannot defend democracy abroad when the single individual denies it at home. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Murphy, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate following all other members in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a panel of distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. Mr. David Albright is the president of the Institute for Science and International Security. Mr. Anthony Ruggiero is a senior fellow and senior director of the Nonproliferation and Biodefense Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Professor Teresa Sabonis-Helf is the concentration chair for Science, Technology, and International Affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Thank you all for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I will ask each of you to keep your verbal remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for members' questions. I will now recognize Mr. Albright for his opening statement.
Chairman Keene, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing and inviting me to testify. Is that better now? Rosatom, its subsidiaries, and its senior personnel deserve far greater sanctions today. Rosatom is not just a benign commercial nuclear energy supplier. As has been pointed out, Rosatom has actively participated in the illegal seizure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, a seizure that we all recognize has caused an increased risk of a major nuclear accident. Rosatom officials are not authorized to operate these reactors. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi has called the situation, quote, not sustainable and risks nuclear safety and security. Rosatom is also complicit in the human rights violations of Ukrainian plant personnel, violations that include torture. Rosatom actively contributes importantly to the production of Russian weapons systems used against Ukraine. A case in point is the Shahed 136 kamikaze drone that Russia has used to destroy much of Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure and terrorize its population. Rosatom helps build the Shahed 136 drones via its important subsidiary, JSC Umatex, at the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. JSC Alabuga, which runs the Special Economic Zones, produces the Shahed 136 drones under a contract with the Russian Defense Ministry with extensive aid from Iran. Umatex is involved in providing carbon fiber to this plant that's making the Shahed 136 drones. Umatex is rightly sanctioned by the United States for its supply of carbon fiber to Russia's military-industrial complex, as is JSC Alabuga and its subsidiaries. However, Rosatom has not been sanctioned for its support of Shahed 136 production, or more broadly for its support of Russia's military-industrial complex, which is growing by the day. Iran's Bushehr nuclear power reactor stands out as an example of the type of risks Rosatom and its predecessor organizations have undertaken to obtain lucrative contracts in countries not prepared institutionally or culturally to deal with the complex array of issues involved in operating reactors safely, preventing reactor accidents, and preparing to deal with them if they occur. Russia's nuclear export enterprises also have shown their willingness in their hunt for contracts to ignore the Iranian regime's secret drive for nuclear weapons and its violations of International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. In the case of Iran, Rosatom provided a reactor with multiple safety deficiencies to a country with infrastructure too weak to support it. These deficiencies and the difficulty of fixing them have been well documented by the IAEA's Operational Safety Review Team's analysis and multiple assessments by the World Association of Nuclear Operators. One has to wonder if Iran's Bushehr power reactor is safe enough to operate today, despite years of intensive safety modifications and improvements. And it should be noted that a major reactor accident risks spreading radiation over nearby Gulf states after only about 12 hours, and that's based on assessments by Rosatom companies. Many problems have resulted from Russia's and Rosatom's less than acceptable designs and parts. This is at Bushehr, the Iran reactor. This has necessitated years of replacement of faulty parts, creation of new operating manuals and changes in operation, and creation of safety and emergency procedures, all aimed at bringing Bushehr up to something approaching modern safety standards. Yet after more than 10 years since the Bushehr reactor started, the task remains incomplete. So from my point of view, countries should avoid Rosatom. For countries contemplating or building nuclear power reactors for the first time, Rosatom reactors, while economically appealing on the purchasing side, may turn out to be huge economic liabilities on the operational side, effects that would be aggravated enormously in the case of a serious reactor accident. While Russia has learned about handling severe nuclear reactor accidents the hard way, many of the developing countries contemplating nuclear power reactors do not have adequate supporting infrastructure and emergency response capabilities to deal with a major reactor accident. And Rosatom seeks customers without proper regard for a country's stability or its ability to ensure the safety and security of the reactor. Now, moving from warning to sanctioning Rosatom may seem harsh, even with the necessary and appropriate waivers. These should include nuclear reactor safety, operating nuclear reactors, and a wind-down period for other existing foreign contracts with Rosatom. However, combined with Rosatom's role in illegally occupying the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and contributing importantly to outfitting Russia's illegal military attacks against Ukraine, sanctioning Rosatom, its subsidiaries, and its key personnel today is deserved and overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albright. I now recognize Mr. Ruggiero for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Keene, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today on this important topic. My testimony is informed by my work on sanctions and proliferation issues at the Departments of State and the Treasury, as a foreign policy fellow for Senator Rubio, and in the White House National Security Council, where I served as Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense. Russia invaded Ukraine more than 2 years ago, and Russia's state-run nuclear corporation, Rosatom, boasted that its export revenue increased 15% in 2022, with a 10-year portfolio of foreign orders worth $200 billion. The company forecasts that its 2023 revenue would increase by 40%. There are two main drivers for how the nuclear company of an aggressor state has expanding revenue while the country is largely shunned from the international community. First, the Biden administration has not yet articulated a strategy for ensuring that America and its allies end their reliance on Russia's nuclear sector. And second, Washington saw Russia as a partner in civil nuclear cooperation, allowing Rosatom and Moscow to undercut and decimate U.S. and Western companies competing in the same market. Rosatom and Russia are also engaged in activities contrary to American foreign policy and national security interests. In my written testimony, I detailed how Rosatom and Sino-Russian nuclear cooperation plays a critical role in enhancing Beijing's nuclear weapons capabilities, including China's effort to build 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035. I also reviewed Rosatom's role in a potential nuclear disaster at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe. The Biden administration started to use sanctions in February 2023 against a few Russian nuclear and Rosatom-linked individuals and entities. But these were not part of a coordinated strategy. For example, I note in my written testimony that the administration has not sanctioned a single member of Rosatom's management board, even though the United Kingdom has sanctioned the entire board in March 2023. The Biden administration understands the problem. A senior Energy Department official noted recently that it is, quote, gravely concerning, end quote, that Russia supplies about 20% of the fuel used by U.S. nuclear reactors. Recent promising reports suggest that the administration and the U.S. nuclear industry are warming to the idea of a ban on imports of Russian fuel. In my written testimony, I offered 3 recommendations for Congress and 3 recommendations for the Biden administration. Specifically, Congress should mandate a strategy to end reliance on Rosatom. It should require the administration to make a sanctions determination within 60 days on Rosatom, its management and supervisory boards, and related entities and individuals. The strategy should also include plans to respond to potential Russian retaliatory actions, including ending the export of enriched uranium and other products to the United States and its allies. Congress could also require a review of the U.S.-Russia Civilian Nuclear Cooperation Agreement to ensure that it is consistent with the new approach to civil nuclear cooperation with Russia. For the administration, I recommend using existing sanctions authorities to prohibit activities with Rosatom, including purchases of reactor fuel, reactor services, and reactor construction, as well as other related services over a 1 to 4 year wind-down period, and then using that time to work with allies in the nuclear industry to facilitate a transition to alternative suppliers. We need a coordinated strategy, an effort to reinforce that Washington and our allies will not return to business as usual with Russia when the war in Ukraine ends. This effort should incentivize a transition to U.S. and allied nuclear industries as alternative suppliers over a 4-year period to end Russia's domination and ensure that China does not fill the void. If the Biden administration is unwilling to pursue this path, Congress should mandate it through legislation. Thank you for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ruggiero. I now recognize Professor Sarbanes-Helf for her opening statement.
Chairman Keane, Ranking Member Keating, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today on Russia's Rosatom Corporation. The Russian government's behavior in Ukraine and at home is shocking and infuriating. We struggle to find useful levers that might limit Russia's reach and ambition. Alas, sanctioning Rosatom may not be such a lever. Most sanctions against Rosatom, however intuitively appealing, will neither constrain Russia significantly, nor will they address the current nuclear fuel imbalance that the world faces. Sanctions could disrupt markets in ways that would boost Rosatom's revenue while disadvantaging ourselves and our allies. Some sanctions, if applied incautiously, could even threaten nuclear power plant safety. Regarding your future moves against Rosatom, I urge you to consider 3 key factors: security of supply, the safety of nuclear energy, and the need to focus our efforts on developing a more resilient pool of nuclear fuel sources. Let's begin with security of supply. The EU's shift to American natural gas was possible only because the U.S. had available supply. We do not have that kind of flexibility in nuclear fuel. 18% of European Union reactors are Russian or Soviet design. For these reactors, fuel rods are an issue. Westinghouse has developed substitute fuel rods for Ukraine, but does not yet have capacity or licensing to supply all of Europe. Rosatom and its affiliates are also deeply embedded in fuel production and other services. Reliance on Rosatom is widespread globally, not only in Europe. Even the United States purchases 20% of its low-enriched uranium from a Rosatom subsidiary. We are not yet in a position to meet all of our domestic nuclear fuel needs. we are definitely not in a position to extend nuclear energy supply security to our allies. Let us also consider the safety of nuclear energy. Criticisms of Rosatom are justified. It has been complicit with the Russian state in nuclear piracy, and it illegally manages the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. In spite of this, Rosatom's sustained relationship with the International Atomic Energy Agency plays an essential role in keeping Russian nuclear energy and the world safer. Rosatom's Director General, Alexei Likhachev, met with the IAEA Director 8 times since March of 2022 for discussions regarding Zaporizhzhia. Rosatom has certainly not responded to all of the IAEA's concerns, but it has taken measures to harden the facility, it has provided mobile diesel fuel boilers to enhance safety, and most importantly, it has complied with the IAEA insistence that Zaporizhzhia not be used to generate electricity, a measure that both enhances safety and reduces the gains to Russia of occupying the facility. In a broader sense, using sanctions to isolate Rosatom is bad for global nuclear safety. Remember the tragedy of Chernobyl. Since the early post-Soviet era, the nuclear power community has made integration of Russian plant operators and leaders a high priority, raising standards and promoting a culture of safety. Because an accident or major incident anywhere affects confidence in nuclear power everywhere, keeping Rosatom and Russia tightly engaged in the community of nuclear professionals is a safety imperative. At this time, our best path to enhance energy security in the nuclear sector comes from diversification of fuel sources. Concern about Russia has already sparked substantial innovation here and abroad. In the United States, our shuttered capacity to process enriched uranium is now relicensed and produced 7,000 tons of uranium hexafluoride last year. Our production of HALEU fuel for the next generation reactors is also underway. Overseas, Westinghouse is leading the way to replace Russian fuel rods. In a more distant region, Kazakhstan is finding a new path to market. Kazakhstan has long been the lead producer of world uranium, but dependent on Russia for refining, enrichment, and transport. Now, France is expanding mining operations in Kazakhstan, increasing French enrichment capability, and shepherding an ambitious consortium to strengthen the Middle Corridor route, reducing the region's dependence on Russia for transport. Infrastructure realignment takes time. Reducing Rosatom's relative role in world nuclear energy production is essential, but can best be accomplished not by sanctions, but by aggressively expanding the field of viable, competent nuclear energy material producers. With China rising in this sector, the discipline of managed competition will serve us well for the next contest over nuclear energy's future. We should strive to engage that competition together with our European allies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stavridis. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Ruggiero, can you characterize Rosatom's support for China's nuclear weapons program?
Yes, they have delivered fuel to some of China's nuclear reactors. The Department of Defense, the Assistant Secretary, I believe, for Space Policy, testified before Congress about the role of those reactors in producing plutonium. And the department was so worried about this particular subject that it actually took that part of his testimony out and published a press release to highlight it for the public.
Thank you. Mr. Albright, do you believe that a mandatory sanctions bill from the U.S. Congress is necessary to push the Biden administration to ramp up pressure on Rosatom, its subsidiaries, and its corporate officers, and to help the U.S. and our allies reduce dependence on Rosatom? I'm sorry, if you can,
Sorry.
please turn your mic on.
Is it on now?
Yes.
Okay. No, I think legislation would be very helpful. I think the Biden administration has been slow to pursue this issue, and I think the Congress can play a very useful role in increasing the sanctions on Rosatom and its subsidiaries, and also play an important role in boosting our capabilities to replace Rosatom. And could I add one thing to Anthony's answer?
Sure.
Russia's supporting the construction of a breeder reactor in China. And as far as we can determine, that will be China's only way to produce the plutonium it needs to increase its arsenal up to 1,000, let alone 1,500. And as far as we can determine, we're still investigating it. Russia has not said that its assistance, peaceful in nature as it is, cannot be misused to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. The U.S. has always taken that kind of position in supplying nuclear assistance, but Russia has not. And so through Russians' assistance, China may be getting the only way it can to dramatically increase its nuclear arsenal.
Okay. Mr. Rosario, your answer to that question?
Your first
Regarding
question,
the
correct?
necessity to push the Biden administration to ramp up pressure on its subsidiaries, on Rosatom and subsidiaries?
Right, as I noted in the oral testimony and the written testimony, this is all about a strategy. It really starts with a strategy, starts with the alternative suppliers that the professor mentioned. I wish this was easy. I wish it was as simple as just putting Rosatom and people on an entity list, or excuse me, on the SDN list. You could do that with some of the senior leadership, but it's going to require a plan, and it seems that the administration is not on that pathway right now.
And if, to continue with you, any serious sanctions effort against Rosatom will require responsible but narrow waiver authority. How long do you assess such waivers need to be for different parts of the nuclear supply chain, specifically enriched uranium?
Right. I think, we've seen different reports about what that timeline would look like. I've seen some reports of 2028 is one of the dates that's out there. There's more parts of the supply chain, unfortunately, that Rosatom is in. There's also carve-outs in the U.S. sanctions already that might be used by whether it's the IAEA or other UN organizations to continue working with Rosatom.
Okay. Mr. Albright, in general, how would you assess Rosatom's commitment to nuclear safety and security, and what safety concerns exist over Rosatom-built plants still in operation in Europe and around the world?
Well, I think we recently did a kind of an in-depth look at safety concerns at the Bushehr reactor in Iran. And so it's a little hard for me to talk about Europe, but at Bushehr, you could clearly see that there were immense safety problems that were being pointed out by WANO teams, were pointed out by the IA investigatory teams, and it was based on Rosatom providing a deficient reactor. And so I think Rosatom lags behind modern safety considerations that are applied to Western reactors. And so I think the Rosatom presents a safety. And in the Bushehr, you do have to wonder if it could have a major nuclear reactor accident.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Keating for any questions that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Senate passed House-held National Security Supplemental Bill includes $2.72 billion to support domestic uranium enrichment, $149 million for the National Nuclear Security Administration's ability to respond to the security situation in Ukraine, $98 million for investments in the development and production of isotopes. Professor Sabonis-Helf, how important is that work to this issue? How important is that bill to this issue?
So I would say particularly the appropriations for the HALEU fuel is something we have to take very seriously. The United States is unable to move ahead with our small modular reactors without access to HALEU fuel, which we up until now have imported from Russia. So being able to ramp up our capacity to take leadership in this next generation of reactors is absolutely urgent. I would also concur that the other pieces of what you just described are critical components. And so I also concur that releasing the resources for the actual defense of Ukraine is also an urgent piece of this puzzle.
Thank you. And I spoke yesterday with the U.S. ambassador to Poland, and we were commenting on what he termed one of the largest, private sector investments that we've been involved with in recent history with Poland in terms of their nuclear investment and how important that is. And similar activities going on with the U.S. and our European allies in Romania and Bulgaria as well. Companies like Westinghouse have taken a lead in this regard. And this shift, on basics of suppliers for nuclear reactors is critical. So can you just comment, anyone, on how important it is for the U.S. engagement itself? How important that is as a necessity in dealing with Russia's malign influence, because we can sanction, but we can also control better as well. Professor, if you want.
Sir, the United States, under older OECD requirements, the amount of economic support we could lend to countries in developing nuclear was limited in an effort to keep European nations from competing against each other. The unfortunate longer-term downside of that was that both Russia and China offer substantial packages which enable, in many cases, countries that are not ready for nuclear to embrace it. Our cooperation with Poland is absolutely essential. It is a new-to-nuclear nation that is ready for nuclear power, that experiences the kind of governance stability and the grid membership needed for nuclear to be successful. I think our new relationship with Poland on this next generation nuclear is absolutely the model for how the United States can recapture a meaningful role in the export of essential nuclear energy technologies.
Yeah, and also, I just want to comment, too, that for those people that think this issue is remote somehow, and it's not important to the U.S., which I just fail to understand in terms of our own domestic security. Could you comment, too, on the fact how important this is and the benefits we get from this kind of investment for jobs right here in America and America economic interests?
We cannot treat nuclear energy as purely a commercial operation because it is so strategically critical. But in terms of the jobs that it represents, this entire new sector is rather extraordinary. We have just recently relicensed the largest facility in the United States. We are building new facilities. We are talking about jobs, and not only good, high-paying jobs, but spread throughout the United States rather than concentrated in one place. And I think that what we see here is that my colleague's recommendation that we need a clear strategy here. That strategy needs to incorporate how we harness American expertise to recapture a role in this industry.
Yeah, and being a member of this committee, as well as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'm also keenly aware of what our military has been telling us in terms of the effects of climate change and how important that is as well. It is one of the existential threats we have in our country and in the planet, and it's also a very big military danger that we have to address. So this will do that as well. I wish we could have some more time, but my time has run out, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I now recognize Mr. Self of Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the legislative branch. We have been looking for a way to change the behavior of the executive branch on several national security issues to include the southern border. So I hear, as background, sanctions on Russian gas and oil have not worked. You, sir, mentioned discretionary sanctions authority that the executive branch has today that they have not used. They are not using what they have available to them today. So we are considering executive branch action, which I am not sanguine will change the executive branch behavior in this manner. I hear a lot about sanctions in this discussion. My concern is, according to the World Nuclear Association, my concern is how are we going to replace the sources? Because as of 2020, when we look at Russia is going to go down between now and 2030, substantial amount of their capability. Urenco basically the West, is going to go down in their capability. That includes the U.S. France is going to stay steady. Others are going to go up 8 times, and that includes such allies, that's facetious, as Argentina, Brazil, India, Pakistan, and Iran are going to increase 8 times, as I said. The big one is China. China is going to go up 3 times. So while we talk about sanctions, how are we going to keep our nuclear industry viable if the only people that are going up substantially in their capability to enrich are basically people who do not agree with us, who some are classified as adversaries? So please, now that's 2020 figures, but while we discuss sanctions, if we sanction this, how are we going to replace the needs of our own industry? Microphone, sir.
Oh, that's the discussion is that 2 tracks are needed. I think Chairman Keating pointed out, or I'm sorry, Chairman Keane pointed out that the sanctions can build the pressure to create the space and the incentive to create the alternatives. So I think they work together.
Well, then we need more. I appreciate your word strategy, sir. I really do. But a strategy has got to have something beyond just competition. Are we looking at Defense Production Act? What do you suggest? And I've read your three recommendations to the legislative branch, but more than a strategy, how would we get there? Because a strategy has to have some capability backing it up. A long time as a military planner, a strategy is worthless without the capability to execute the strategy.
Sir, I think that's why I emphasize replacement capacity over sanctions. I think that what has happened recently in Kazakhstan and to a lesser extent in Uzbekistan is extremely important. Kazakhstan produces more mined uranium for the world market than any other nation. Until recently, it's been fully captive to Russia because Russia does the enrichment, Russia does the transport. In the current situation, France has opened new mines together with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, is handling the transit route to France, and France is ramping up enrichment. That's one example of what has changed in the past 2 years, I think very much for the better. I do think that our pursuit of critical materials with Central Asia is a very important part of thinking about the future, because bringing enrichment and processing back to the United States is more urgent in my estimation than enhancing mining in the United States. But I would also call your attention to the fact that, as you noted, China is very much on the rise. Now, we know that in an earlier era, Chairman Mao was much more interested in nuclear weapons than in nuclear energy. But in recent years, China has moved to a hyper-development phase in its 11th five-year plan. China now has 55 operable reactors and 27 under construction. And so a lot of China's effort to build up in this sphere is to meet its own rising demand. They're still finishing building their grid. They still have huge expansion.
My time is up. They're building not only nuclear plants,
Yes,
coal plants every week, solar, everything. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Self. I now recognize Mr. Costa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Professor Sponis-Heff and Professor Teresa's, excuse me, and Mr. Ruggiero, you both talk about a strategy. And it seems clear from your comments that a strategy involves totally eliminating our need to rely on Russia for any future uranium enriched if we're going to maintain our own ability to have independence. Am I correct?
That's correct in my recommendation, yes.
Would you agree, Professor?
Yes, it would.
And I assume, Mr. Albright, you would agree as well. What is a timeline for those of us who are laypersons that it would take to develop this ability to remove our dependence from Russia and to develop our own capacity with ourselves and maybe in conjunction with some of our allies in Europe that use nuclear power?
Right. It also goes to the previous question as well. I mean, in my view, these are mutually inclusive efforts, increasing alternative suppliers and getting smarter on sanctions. I think right now we're going after some of the what we call the low-hanging fruit on sanctions. We're not focused on things that will have a real impact on the sanction side, and the sanctions will also give a market signal to the industry as well. As I noted previously, 2028 is a date that has been put out there by industry in some circles, and that's only 4 years away. So that's why we've focused on the sort of 1 to 4 year time frame.
That's by talking to people like Westinghouse and others that have experience and expertise in this in terms of developing our own independence.
Sorry to cut you off.
I'm sorry?
Orenco, the what was mentioned previously, their increases, some of those are scheduled to come online.
But we
in
have to give the
28.
signals to the private sector, in fact, if we're going to develop this strategy to develop this independence, right?
Correct.
To a
And-
certain
and-
extent, sir, that signal was already received before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The largest facility in the United States, which is marketed by Converdin, was mothballed. It got an extension to reopen, to relicense in 2021. And this past year, they succeeded in producing already 7,000 tons by the end of last year of uranium hexafluoride. When that facility was at full capacity, the United States produced 20% of the world's hexafluoride, which is more than we need. So getting that facility fully up and running is one of the critical components here.
And that's one of the steps on the way to developing the pellets.
Yes, sir.
So when you say in your comments that sanctions, if they're implied incautiously, what do you mean by incautiously?
Sir, I mean that as soon as Russia was convinced that Europe was taking strong measures in gas, they began manipulating prices significantly. Most nuclear power plants store 2 to 3 years worth of fuel at their site, and none of them will tell you exactly how much fuel they have stored. But the war has been unfolding for over 2 years now, so we have some real concern about the ability of the nuclear power plants in Europe to stay open.
What concerns the three of you the most about, I mean, under the category of lessons learned, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think besides the immediate need, in my view, and I associate my comments with the ranking member, Mr. Keating, about what we need to do to provide this supplemental package for Ukraine and for the other elements that are in that supplemental package. But what lessons do you think this has taught us in the last 2 years?
I think lessons learned. I think one is that it's critical to defeat Russia.
You can't be dependent.
Well, you can, and also that we should not be dependent on
Well,
Russia.
I've said it on the floor. I think President Putin is a war criminal for all the things that he's done. And I think Russia today is a syndicate masquerading or pretending to be a country run by a mob boss.
And a mob boss who's ramping up its military production infrastructure in a very frightening way. And I spent much of the year in Europe, in Germany, and we feel it deeply that lack of U.S. support for the Ukrainians is directly threatening Europe's security.
It threatens Europe. It threatens all of us.
That's right. But
It's a seminal moment in American and world history, and we're playing politics with this. My time's run out, but I'll submit further questions, Mr. Chairman, for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. I now recognize Mr. Moran from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony here today. Very important subject. I'm very concerned about the dependency on Russian uranium and on Rosatom being a major player across the globe in this area. Mr. Albright, I want to start with you and ask you a question, then I'll come over to Mr. Ruggiero. Is that how I say it? Good deal. Mr. Albright, in your opinion, what are the strategic risks of the U.S. and Europe's continued reliance on Rosatom for nuclear energy products and services? And would you compare this reliance to Europe's crippling dependence on Russian oil and natural gas before the war in Ukraine began?
Yeah, no, I would compare it. I mean, at some point, Russia will probably play games with its supply. And it's been mentioned the need to start stockpiling critical resources in anticipation of that, but I think Europe will be facing similar struggles as it faced with Russia's cutoff of natural gas.
And what strategic risks do you think that poses both in Europe and the United States when we look at beyond just the economy, but we look militarily?
Well, to deal with the situation is expensive, and it causes a lot of, I wouldn't understate it, discomfort to the public. It was a tough winter after Russia cut off the natural gas. So, I mean, it's absolutely necessary to prepare for that, and it causes effects that are hard to deal with politically and expensive to deal with.
So, Professor, do you agree that we need to work towards independence from Rosatom as it relates to uranium production and provision?
Absolutely. I think Russia's behavior will be greatly moderated if it's a much less important player in this game.
Mr. Ruggiero, in your opening testimony, you referenced several efforts to increase U.S. and allied enrichment capacity. Companies in the nuclear fuel cycle will need to commit to investing potentially billions of dollars to replace Russian supplies. Would you agree that it is important for those companies to have certainty moving forward in the form of clear government policy and tough sanctions that a flood of Russian exports will not strand their assets in later years once they make this investment?
I agree, and that goes back to Congressman Costa's question of what do you worry about? What I worry about is that we don't develop this strategy and the war somehow ends, and then we go back to our reliance on Russia, and we don't give that market signal, and they either invest things that are not needed or they wind up not investing it. I think that's why right now is the time to develop this strategy with both the sanctions and the alternative suppliers working together.
Yeah, because this uranium production is not like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in my kitchen. It takes a lot of capital up front, capital investment, takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of effort and risk, frankly, to enter that market. Would you agree with that?
That's right, and we have to get the balance between what we want here in the U.S. and what we want to work with our allies both in Canada and Europe and elsewhere. There's a good mix there, and it's going to take some time to get that right.
Back to you, Mr. Albright. Stakeholders have predicted that building capacity in the United States and fully replacing Russian nuclear is a long-term project expected to take years, just like what I just referenced. What regulatory burdens stand in the way, and what are ways Congress can reduce the barrier to entry? And I'll ask you the same question, Professor, once we get an answer. If you'll press your button, please.
I'm not sure I can address the regulatory issues, but certainly there needs to be support from the executive and the legislative branch that this is a priority, and there will be some support, financial support, for these activities so that the companies can be incentivized to take the risk. And so I think that's a critical part of it. And we've done this before. I mean, our nuclear industry has always, when it was growing, had tremendous support from the federal government.
Professor, do you have comment on the regulatory burdens that stand in the way?
Actually, I'd like to highlight one huge breakthrough, and that is that small modular reactors are licensed under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it's the first time we've licensed a new design of reactor in a very long time. I don't think the United States is a credible salesman of these reactors in other countries if we don't have them on our own territory. So I think that the fact that we've made that move forward is an extremely important one, and I think that removes what would otherwise have been a huge barrier in terms of next generation.
Mr. Ruggiero, real quickly, my last question. What global market implications do you predict during the process of winding down dependence on Russian nuclear fuel and sources?
Well, I think they understand, the industry understands that this is a conversation that's happening, and that's why I think you could do some sanctions now and some smarter sanctions in the short term to reinforce that as well.
I thank you all. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. I now recognize Mr. Wilson from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of the witnesses for being here today. And Mr. Rogero, the Biden administration has repeatedly waived sanctions against Rosatom in order to facilitate Rosatom's work with Iran's nuclear program. This is despite the fact that Rosatom has been credibly accused of providing material support to aid war criminal Putin's military invasion of Ukraine, which is sanctionable by U.S. law. Would you classify this scheme as a sanctions evasion?
Well, if they're getting waivers, I mean, there's always the question of whether why the administration is still issuing the Iran waivers, giving the Iran subject. But we continue to work with Rosatom, even though, as you noted, they work with China nuclear program, they work with ZNPP. So yes, I think moving along the pathway of ending reliance on Russia and Rosatom is the best way forward.
And I appreciate you clarifying. Thank you very much. And approximately how much money is the Biden administration allowing the Kremlin and war criminal Putin to make through Rosatom's operations in Iran?
I'm not sure about the specific number, but I'm certainly happy to take that as a question for the record.
I mean, yeah, my understanding is it's certainly not a public number, but we've been investigating internal Bouchier-related documents that we found on the internet, and it's millions of dollars just in improving some of the safety conditions at the plant and writing manuals. But it's substantially larger than millions of dollars per every 2 years or so.
Would it probably be in like trade too, of military equipment and,
Yeah. Well, but also I should add, they're building Bouchier 2 and 3, and that project is valued at about $8 billion. So it'll probably be significantly higher. On Bouchier 1, which is operational, it's fixing the problems that came with buying that particular reactor. And Iran coming to terms that its safety culture was woefully inadequate. It has very poor regulatory environment. And so as Iran tries to, in a sense, create a safer reactor, it's having to spend considerable amount of money.
and it just,
Rosatom benefits from that.
it's inconceivable to me that there would be waivers that we could in any way benefit the regime in Tehran, and particularly in light of just 6 weeks ago, Iran provided drone attacks on American military, killing 3 Army reservists from Georgia, wounding another 40 people, Americans, and then over 150 drone attacks in the last 6 months. And just, I just can't visualize where a waiver would be in any way allowed by this administration. And with just 6 weeks ago, 3 young Americans were murdered by the regime in Tehran. With that in mind, Mr. Albright, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant contains sensitive export control American nuclear technology. According to CNN, last year, the Biden administration asked Rosatom not to touch the technology. Do you trust that Rosatom will respect the export control rules? How would that benefit them if they actually did?
Yeah, and just to reinforce your point, it was horrible with these drone attacks, and with Iranian assistance, they're happening all the time in Ukraine and terrorizing the population. And so Iran's drone program deserves much more attention. Now, on the technology, we work on sort of the more criminal side of nuclear supply chains, and I would assume Russia's already investigated whatever they could find as much as they could, and regardless of what they say, they probably are trying to benefit from our technology.
Well, I just sincerely hope, bipartisan, that we can face that we are sadly in a war we didn't choose, and that is with the dictators with rule of gun invading the democracies with rule of law, beginning February 2022, with war criminal Putin invading, and then October 7, the Iran puppets invading and slaughtering the people of Israel. And so this should be bipartisan that we're working together because they do have a goal: death to Israel, death to America. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I have one follow-up question to Mr. Albright regarding Rosatom's role in the Iran nuclear sector. Is this cooperation limited entirely to the civilian nuclear energy program?
As far as I know, I don't know any evidence that Russia would convey nuclear weapons-related technology to Iran. Part of the problem, though, in Iran is that Bushehr is it's a modern, semi-modern nuclear reactor. And Iran is using that knowledge and will openly say to be able to build smaller research reactors, which could, in the future, produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. So I think that Russia's technology is not well protected or controlled. And
So it
Iran-
could, by that definition, be assisting in, Rosatom could be assisting in Iran in its goal of creating a nuclear weapon.
Using, in the sense of producing plutonium for nuclear weapon in a future reactor in Iran, yes.
Thank you. With no further questions. Yes, do you have anything? Okay. With no further questions from members, I want to thank our witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional written questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond to these promptly in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.